An expectation we usually define as an anticipation of the quality of a person's performance output. So if I hold high expectations for somebody in my group, that means I have a hunch that the next thing she says is going to be good. Or if I have low expectations for somebody in my group, that means I have a hunch the next time he says something, it's going to be a waste of time. Not always conscious. I don't think people go around in these groups trying to decide she's the smartest, he's the next smartest, he's the next smartest. I don't think they do that. But you can still talk about these things even if they're not always conscious. And usually they're relative to pairs of actors. It's not so much that I think she's really good at everything, it's just I think that she's better than she is. Or I think he's better than she is. It's always a relative thing. Yeah. So if you think about a Bales group, you say, well, it's not, they probably don't say, I think she's really good at everything, because they're not really concerned with that problem. What they probably say, if you ask them to make it conscious, is, I think she had the best ideas in our group for that problem. Where does expectations come from? They come from the unit evaluations. Unit evaluations generalize into performance expectations, which means if I'm in a discussion group like this and somebody says something and I think she's right, and then she says something else and I say she's right, and she says something else and I think she's right, at some point that generalizes into I think she knows how to do this. And it works the other way too. She says something and I think that's not helpful. She says something else and I think bad idea. She says something else, I think nope. Eventually I think she doesn't understand how to do this task. So at some point a series of unit evaluations generalize into a performance expectation. And once I form them, the world looks different, because not only do I think she had good ideas, but I think the next thing she says is likely to be useful. Or not only do I think she has bad ideas, but I think the next thing she says is going to distract us. What I was describing, of course, is an ideal situation. I mean, you're not in a group where you think every single thing he says is good. But it's sort of a ratio. If most of them are good and a few of them are bad, it'll take a little longer, but I can still form high expectations for him. If most of what she says is bad and a little bit of it's good, I can still form low expectations for her, but it takes a little longer. And we don't need to worry about how long it's going to take. All we need to know is they seem to be able to do this within the first few minutes of interaction. So remember, a unit evaluation always follows a performance output. Sometimes it's public, sometimes it's private, but the unit evaluation generalize into performance expectations for a person. Let's presume, just to simplify situations, that when you set up this task-focused, collectively oriented discussion group, they're all unfamiliar with each other. They know nothing about each other. So, and that was true in the Bales groups, and that's what makes it so striking that they develop inequality, because they look so similar at the beginning. So we know the inequality is being developed from their interaction process. Nothing about them. But yeah, we'll come into other cases where it goes faster. So now we can look at the interaction sequence. And this means a very, very simplified idea about what's going on in these groups. Let's say you can look at their interaction as a series of sequences. Each sequence begins with an action opportunity. Somebody gives somebody else a chance to perform. Maybe asking who has good ideas, or what do you think, or I haven't heard what you say. Or simply you stop talking and stare at the person. There's a lot of ways to give action opportunities. But let's assume an action opportunity starts. It's very likely to be followed by a performance output. You ask somebody what she thinks ought to be done, she's very likely to tell you. She may not. I mean, she could reject it. If she rejects it, it starts over. Somebody else gets an action opportunity. Performance output's always followed by a unit evaluation. For simplicity, we'll say they're either positive or negative. Always occurs. Maybe public, maybe private. Agreement or disagreement when you have conflicting performance outputs. And agreement and disagreement have to be resolved too. And if there's a disagreement, there has to be influence. Somebody has to say, I think you're right and I was wrong. Or, I think I'm right and you were wrong. Because they can't go on until they resolve their disagreements. So, if you have conflicting performance outputs, you have negative unit evaluations. That's the sequence of interaction. That's the full sequence. You may not go through the whole step. If you don't go through the whole step, it starts over again. So it's just a way of looking at what they're doing when they're working on the problem. They're going through this sequence of interactions. I want to introduce the idea of theoretical construct. Theoretical construct means something that is useful to talk about, but you can't see it or feel it or touch it. And when I try to explain, and that's what the expectation states are. When I try to explain the idea of theoretical constructs, I usually tell people, think about the idea of a conscience. If you say somebody has a well-developed conscience, you can't see it or feel it or touch it, but that helps you make predictions of how they're going to act. And that's what a performance expectation is like. You can't see it or touch it, but it helps you predict how the person's going to act. It's a task-specific, person-specific ability conception. And it's usually not conscious. I don't think people in these groups say, okay, now I know who had good ideas. No. If you give them a questionnaire, they can think about it and they'll probably come up with answers. But they don't usually behave that way, I think. So to go back to our ideas of the subtasks, remember one of the subtasks was to figure out who's going to be useful in this group. To say the same thing slightly differently, a subtask is to form performance expectations and to attach them to everybody, including to myself. And how do they get formed? From the pattern of unit evaluations and influence. So if you think about interaction, think about it as having action opportunities, performance outputs, unit evaluations, agreement, disagreement, and influence. Those are the components of interaction. And now I can say the expectations that people form will govern the distribution of all of the components of the power and prestige structure. The higher the expectations I hold for somebody, the more likely I am to give that person an action opportunity. The more likely he or she is to accept it and make a performance output, the more likely he or she is to get a positive unit evaluation, to exert influence if somebody disagrees, to be thought of as having leadership and competence. So all of these things are the components of the power and prestige structure. And in the boards of directors study, what you saw, I think, is that the interaction process becomes very orderly once expectations form. People decide whom they want to encourage to talk and whom they want to discourage. And when everybody has formed expectations for everybody, that'll govern the way they continue their interaction. It becomes much more orderly. There's no more competition, or much less competition. There's much less uncertainty, and it just goes through the problem. Once the power and prestige structure emerges, it tends to be stable. Remember that? Question is, why does it tend to be stable once it emerges? Why isn't it always changing? The answer, I think, is that once the expectations exist, they affect the conditions that created them. So the higher the expectations I hold for you, the more likely am I to think that anything you say sounds good. Positive unit evaluation. Positive unit evaluations are what create high expectations. Just like negative unit evaluations create low expectations. So one of the reasons that you get this stability when the power and prestige structure has emerged, I think the main reason, is that the expectations that are produced the power and prestige structure are affected by some of the things that they create.
So like confirmation bias, really?
Yeah, you can call it that if you want to. Yeah. If you're a good student in school, in our terms, that would mean the teacher held high expectations for you. There was probably a time when the teacher asked a question and you answered it, and it was not a really good answer, but the teacher said, "That's right." There was another kid in your class that everybody thought was dumb. In other words, they had formed low expectations for that kid. That kid said something, may have not been all that bad. Teacher said, wrong. So what you're seeing there is the distribution of evaluations being biased by the expectations that exist. And that's why the power and prestige structure tends to be stable once it emerges. It's fairly simple if you think about performance expectations. Remember I said they're relative to people, to pairs of people. So you can think about really the way it looks to somebody in the group is not so much that I'm trying to get the whole structure here, but if I hear her say something and him say something, I have differential expectations for the two of them.